afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday, the 16th of January. My name's Maggie Lennon. We'll start the programme as we normally do with the most up to date coronavirus statistics. As of 2 o'clock yesterday, there were 7,833 new COVID cases confirmed, either through a lateral flow test or a PCR test. 21 newly reported deaths of people who had tested positive. There have been 4,397,912 people who've received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination and 4,064,533 who've received their second, with 3,184,700 having received a third dose or booster. 1,540 people were in hospital with recently confirmed COVID-19, 46 of whom were in intensive care. And since the start of the pandemic, sadly, a total of 10,059 patients in Scotland who tested positive have died. I'm joined today by Elena Witham, MSP for Carrick, Cumnock and Doon, and Jools Bell, Councillor for Angus and Member of Women for Independence National Committee. Good morning, good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon. It's lovely to see you both.
It's lovely to see you too, although at a distance. One of these days we'll have everybody back in the studio. I can't wait. We're going to open the show today with just a quick mention of Djokovic. Obviously, the news has just come through in the last couple of hours that he is actually going to be deported and returned home over the visa wrangle. Jools, with your Public Health Scotland hat on, was this the right decision from Australia?
I absolutely think so. There can't be one rule for everyone and one rule for entitled white men.
And would you agree with that, Elena?
Absolutely, I would agree with that. I think the Australian government took the right decision to revoke the visa and send him home, because the message that sends out to the public is that there's one rule for entitled, privileged white men and one rule for the rest of us.
But it might have been better if the Australians had done this a little bit better. I mean, it has been a bit bitty. He did seem to get exemptions, then they were overturned, then there was an appeal, and that was overturned. The overturning was overturned, and now the overturning's been overturned, and it's been overturned again. You can understand why there's been some frustration within the Djokovic camp, and also amongst other tennis players. Quite a few people on the circuit are quite supportive of him. Are you surprised at that, Jools?
Yes, I am really, because I can't imagine that any of them were missed out of any communications around what the rules were. You know, they've had the opportunity to plan ahead and to make sure that they meet all the criteria for entrance into the country. So, you know, why squidge around making things up and claiming things that are patently teetering on the edge of veracity, really? I mean, the rules are there to follow. There's no excuse to not have done it, and he has no one else to blame but himself, frankly.
Things might get worse from though when he gets home. Apparently, having been the Serbian government originally kind of took the view that this was some kind of Serbian plot or the anti-Serbian politicization of the situation. But since it's emerged that he went to a public event the day after he tested positive and he didn't wear a mask in breach of Serbia's own rules, the suggestion is, Elena, that he might be in trouble when he gets home. Serve him right, do you think?
I think so, because I think it mirrors some of the things that are happening here now, in the UK, in terms of people acting in one way where they feel as if they have some privilege and expecting everybody else to act according to the rules. Now, if he was out there, the day after being, tested, actually testing positive and being out in public doing those things, I think he does have to face the music, because it's undermining his own country's public health messaging.
Well, now we can get back to just enjoying the tennis. And just a bit of a shout out to Andy Murray. He sadly lost the final of the Sydney Classic, but this was the event we should remember that 3 years ago looked like it might be the end of his career. So the fact that he's come back, got to the final, and just lost out is a good sign. And obviously, we wish him well in the Australian Open. He's reached the final, I think, 5 or 6 times in that competition. Don't think he'll get to the final this time, but Here's looking at you, Andy, and I'm sure the whole nation has their fingers crossed. Moving to a story that is much more sombre and serious. The year is just over a week old, and yet again, the nation and people in Ireland are mourning the murder of Aisling Murphy, a young 23-year-old teacher who was murdered by a violent man while out running. There have been vigils all over Ireland. There's been an outpouring of grief for her. But I just feel, Elena, that here we are again. It's not that long. It's about, 9 months since Sarah Everard's murder at the hands of policemen. And we thought that was going to make a difference in people's attitudes. But here we are again, a young woman, a victim of senseless violence. What on earth are we going to do about this?
For me, what I found really striking was the fact that just hours after her murder, we saw "not all men" trending on Twitter, and to me, that speaks to the wider issue. I worked for Women's Aid for over a decade as a refuge worker and as outreach worker, and I have a huge understanding of the issues around about gender-based violence. And to me, we have this horrific murder of such a young woman just going about her daily life, going out for a run. But we've had so many people, so many women murdered between her and Sarah Everard as well. So it speaks to the wider issue. It's maybe not all men, but it's all women who are at risk. We don't know who the men are who are going to, perhaps attack us when we're out for a jog or out doing our shopping. And it might be that, the man that's closest to you, that you share your life and your house with. But the fact that "not all men" was trending speaks to a wider issue, I think, that we have to start tackling.
Absolutely, because Jules, this is an issue for all men, isn't it? This is an issue for men
Yeah.
to act as role models for other men, to act for role models for their male children.
I couldn't agree more. And challenging the behaviour of their peers as well. When I put forward the motion at my council about gender-based violence, I was seconded by one of my male colleagues, Mark MacDonald, and he was very strong on, checking in, not just his behaviour, but the behaviour of folk he's out with. Things that you think might be a bit jokey need to be called out, and we need more men to stand up and do that. And I really want to see that "Don't Be That Guy" campaign develop and evolve through Police Scotland. Police Scotland tell us that there's one gender-based crime reported every 9 minutes in Scotland, and it's the biggest pull on officers' time. It's the biggest single issue that pulls their time. It's a real challenge. It's definitely a public health issue, and I think we can't move away from it until we really get all men to buy into their role in how we challenge it in society. And that's a really tough gig. I mean, we see, as Elena mentioned, the "not all men" hashtag, but in our licensing committee, we need to consider about, taxi licenses and, who's appropriate to hold pub licenses and what have you. And I think, we need to get a bit tougher on saying, enough is enough, actually, and pull people up for behaviour that's not acceptable. Otherwise,
I confess,
we
Jules,
just can't sort it.
I confess, Jules, I didn't know the statistics were as high as that. One crime every 9 minutes. But there's something else is also bubbling under the surface here, which I actually find almost as disturbing as the "not all men." And that, if you like, is this portrayal of what I call the virtuous victim. So what we're hearing around Aisling is that she was a special girl. Well, she was a woman, let's be honest. And she was a little angel. And in fact, the Taoiseach, Michael Martin, I found his response really quite disturbing. He was kind of making out that somehow this crime was worse because she was a teacher. And he then went into this rather prosaic explanation of how teachers and the national education service is the bedrock of the Irish state, as if somehow that made her murder worse than a murder of any other woman. It's the same when a policeman or woman is murdered in the line of duty. Somehow that's portrayed as being worse than the murder of any other citizen. And I find that quite alarming, but there's been a bit of a backlash. So "she was just out jogging" hashtag, a lot of women have come back and said it doesn't matter what she was doing. And I think we have to be careful, don't we, Elena, that we don't fall into this risk, if you like, of somehow making out that because she was a virtuous young woman in a key public role, that somehow that makes her murder worse, because it wouldn't have mattered what she did for a living. It wouldn't have mattered what she was doing, at what time of day. She was illegally killed by a violent man.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I shared was Len Penny, who we know is a wonderful young Scottish woman who shares Scots language poem. And she created a spoken word piece round about this. And it doesn't matter whose daughter, wife, you know, sister that she is, it doesn't matter what she does. She's a person in her own right who has value. And I think we have to be very careful about making some type of echelon of victims as to who gets the sympathy vote. It really doesn't matter what Aisling did in life. She was murdered, going about her own life, regardless of what activities she did or what role she held. And I think we have to be really careful about this, because the message it sends is that some victims are actually, maybe further down the line of where we should actually have our sympathy with. And that's a terrible message to send out. So I absolutely agree with you on that, Maggie.
And not only is it a terrible message to send out, Jules, it might be part of the problem if somehow it gives some warped men an idea that some women are easy game or easy meat or somehow deserve it more. I did see, Elena, on a tweet that you had put recently about an appalling incident in, I think, Canada a number of years ago, where a number of men and women who were studying engineering, am I right in thinking, Elena, that was on your Twitter that you wrote about this?
It was. I mean, I
Yes.
was 15 years old at the time in Montreal, and it was the Montreal Massacre. And it was a man who decided to go in and shoot dead every woman that he saw because he didn't get a place in the engineering course. And that was the fundamental part in my life where I became a feminist to my core, because it illustrated to me that as a woman, as a young woman, I had no value.
And so, Jules, as I started putting the question towards you, and then I remembered Eleanor's tweet. It is part of the problem, isn't it, that if we somehow give the victims kind of, if you like, special pleading because of what they were doing or what role they had in society, it makes some women more of a victim, do you think, or potentially more of a victim?
Absolutely, and it's a really a layered approach to judgment of whether that woman deserved it or not. It's absolutely shocking. And in Angus, we did a population attitude survey in 2020. A couple of the questions I think are worth pulling out. So a woman is walking down the street when she passes a group of men who start wolf whistling and saying things like, "Hey, sexy, what do you think about the men's behaviour?" Only 73% of our respondents thought that was completely wrong, you know, and if a man looks at his wife's bank statement every month but doesn't let her look at his, only 10% of people thought that that was wrong.
Mm.
There are really embedded attitudes to women and their role in society, and what function they perform, I think. And we just, it's a really, I mean, how you get men in relationships to take their equal share in terms of that emotional labour as well. That, I think, that's just part of the whole spectrum around um, women's place in society. And we may have come quite far, but I think at times, and it's so depressing, we have a huge way to go in
But
terms of
I think you've
equality.
nailed it there. It is exactly that. It's understanding and appreciating women's role in society. And if I mean, that's quite shocking that the attitudinal survey statistics that
Yeah.
you've given us, because that really implies that people do not see women as equal players in society. Having been really quite critical of Michael Martin's comments, which I really did find really quite disturbing. Leo Varadkar, the Deputy Premier, on the other hand, was quite unequivocal. This is an epidemic of violence. It is up to men and boys to get this sorted, and up to society. And there was no mention at all of the role of the victim or whatever. And the other Irish politician who came out very strongly, not perhaps surprising, was Michelle O'Neill from Sinn Féin, who made it absolutely clear where the fault with this lay, and that it was not with the victims, it was with men and boys. And she was hinting that it was a particular issue in Ireland. I don't know if that's true or not, but what I did read this morning is that United Nations have reported that gender-based violence has increased throughout the pandemic. Ellen, does that surprise you or not?
It doesn't surprise me at all. During the pandemic, I was working with the housing minister in my COSLA role at the time in terms of looking at homelessness, and we knew that there was a massive issue of trying to get women out of dangerous situations into temporary accommodation. And I was working with Women's Aid very closely. We knew that there was a parallel pandemic happening. If you're having, women experiencing domestic abuse stuck in a situation where they're complying with public health messages, they're actually in a place where their abuser has access to them all the time. And I think we're going to find that there's huge consequences coming down the line from that, from women who've experienced horrific times over the last 2 years. So it doesn't surprise me in the least.
Well, sticking with women who've been abused, we're now turning to the story of Victoria Giffrey and Andrew Windsor. I think it's the best way to refer to him now, seeing as he's not an HRH anymore, although I think he's still technically a prince. She's going to get her day in court because the attempts to throw out the civil case by Prince Andrew's lawyers was rejected out of hand by the court in New York. But the worrying thing is that her reputation is going to be trashed. With no real defence against what he is alleged to have done, they are going after her reputation. It all started during the appeal when they tried to paint her as nothing more than a cheap money-grabbing slut who was just out for what she could get. And it's now been announced that, not content with going after her, they're also going to start interviewing her husband to try and work out what sort of relationship they had when they met in 2002 and what her state of mind was. And they want to talk to her psychologist as well, because they're beginning to plant the idea, and this is something that a lot of women who've been abused will recognise, that there are false memories. Now, I'm not seeing any of the same sort of reputational trashing happening to Prince Andrew. So, Jools, what do you think should be the appropriate response from Giffrey's defence counsel to this?
I am not a legal expert, but they will be expecting this. It happens all the time with women. We haven't got past that, and they're facing up to the might of the the UK establishment. And I mean, I genuinely don't envy them the task. But one of my favourite hashtags is women supporting women, and I think the sisterhood needs to swoop in and keep an eye on this, and provide a degree of moral support. Um, She must be prepared for this. She is a strong, feisty woman, and I think one of my points is that she shouldn't have to be to go through this. And I think the actions of the defendant's legal team is really quite interesting. They've been wriggling on a hook, and to me that says there's lots to hide there. But again, rich, entitled, white man, part of the establishment. I think the Queen's response is very interesting. So yeah, I'll be watching this with interest, and I'm really interested to see if Victoria Windsor case. I mean, it's a civil case, and there's a lighter burden of proof on a civil case. If there will be a criminal case to follow, I'm very interested to see that, and I think that house of cards is on a very shugly peg.
I think we're all kind of interested to find out if a criminal case might follow, but as you say, the burden of proof is lighter in a civil case. But going back to the first story, Elena, where we were talking about, the reputation of Aisling as this virtuous young teacher, it seems to me if you're a victim of sexual or physical abuse and you survive it, the chances are you're going to have your reputation trounced. And that is also part of the wider problem, is it not?
It absolutely is. I was victim of sexual assault at college in Canada, and As horrific as that was, I think I was prepared for, if my attacker was ever brought to court, that was going to be even more horrific, actually. And thinking about, my entire life being picked apart by the defence. And I think what we see here is we see Virginia Giuffre actually being portrayed by a lot of the American press and in the case previous as somebody who's believable, somebody that's credible. So Windsor's whole defence in this point is going to be to try and actually trash her reputation. But I think fundamentally it fails to understand the consequences of trauma and being trafficked on an individual, on a woman. And I think that we, as Jools says, as the sisterhood, have actually got to get that message out there as well. That, and fundamentally for them to even think about speaking to her husband to understand their relationship or to speak to her psychologist is absolutely abhorrent. Those are sacrosanct places. The relationship you have with the person closest to you and that relationship you have with somebody that's helping you to work through trauma, to actually even try and pretend that it's okay to ask for that in a court proceeding is just disgusting, frankly.
Well, and I would have thought that would be covered by patient doctor privilege anyway, but maybe not. I don't know. One of the things about her response so far that's really impressed me is she came out very quickly once the case was given the green light to say this isn't about the money. I'm not interested in the money. I'm interested in justice. I'm interested in this kind of behaviour being exposed, which may have kind of closed down the suggested route that he might try and buy his way out of this. Although reports recently claim that he's probably about to be declared bankrupt, and if the Queen is sticking to her guns that he has to tackle this as a private citizen, probably wouldn't have any money to pay her off. But that was quite a smart move, I think, Jools, on her behalf. Do you think?
Yes, I do. And also the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell has been found guilty of trafficking. I've seen comments, mostly by men, I have to say, around, Virginia Giuffre knew what she was doing. She was 17, that's over the age of consent. So, well, it is here, but it's not there. And very much that victim blaming. But we know Ghislaine Maxwell trafficked young girls, and she preyed on young girls from a poor background, groomed them, and trafficked them onto rich men. So that I think that is a really important factor that has allowed this to go ahead, and we mustn't underestimate the power of that. There's an established fact there. So yeah, I really I don't think it's an accident that our psychologist is also a woman. You would be naturally drawn to someone who might connect with what has happened for you in terms of that trauma. And her reputation is going to be trashed as well. It's going to affect that whole circle of witnesses. But I don't think the public is so stupid as to not see through what's happening there. I genuinely don't. There's a pattern, and we will see that in play.
What's also interesting is I think just in the last 24 hours or so, Virginia's legal team have come out and said that they've now got people they want to question in preparation for the case later this year. And that includes a witness from the nightclub who claims to have seen Andrew there the night that Virginia said he was there, putting end to this claim that he'd never met her and he wasn't there and he didn't sweat, but he's sweating now. And also to speak to Prince Andrew's ex-personal assistant. Apparently Epstein had 12 separate numbers for Andrew in his little black book. One wonders why he needed 12 numbers. And I did hear something funny yesterday. It suggested it's because Andrew doesn't know that when our phone runs out, you have to recharge it. But maybe that's being a little bit light. But more seriously, Elena, this epidemic of sexual and physical violence that we're seeing all around us, it has to put an end to this sorry state of reputational damage for women who are involved. And the sooner that happens, the better. What more can we be doing? What more needs to be done in order to get the message across that the behaviour that puts women at risk is not going to be tolerated, and men that get involved in putting women at risk are going to have justice meted out against them?
I think that's a fundamental thing that we absolutely need to change and get right. If we think about that, we've got a massive backlog in terms of court cases, and we also have this big issue of it's very few cases that actually get to court and result in convictions for these types of things. And I think if we think about Virginia Giuffre just now, she's admitted in the past in interviews that she was part of getting other younger girls for Ghislaine Maxwell, ultimately for Epstein. And she's come out and said this is, a part of this whole being trafficked, being groomed, and the trauma that's associated with it. And for me, it was looking at some of her detractors overnight have started to trot this out. So I think we have to get the wider message of how trauma affects people into public consciousness. Just recently, we had a debate in the Parliament about, the 16 days of action of ending gender-based violence. And my colleague, Jim Fairley from the SNP, spoke really eloquently about the Don't Be That Guy campaign. And he actually stood up in that Parliament and said, where are all the men? There was us, there was lots of women, and some of us were moved to tears about what we were talking about. And there was not one Labour MSP, male MSP in that chamber. And it's about making sure that we get this message out to every single man that they have to be part of the solution, because if not, we're not going to have that attitudinal change that we need right across society.
I mean, we thought with the Harvey Weinstein case that was a big breakthrough, that the whole Me Too movement was a big breakthrough. But this might prove to be a really major landmark case with all sorts of repercussions, hopefully positive repercussions for women who are victims of sexual and physical violence and trafficking, and who knows what it might end up doing to the royal family or indeed Andrew Windsor. We've talked a lot in that story about trafficking, and trafficking is also in the news in our next piece today. And that is that the United Nations have come out and made it very, very clear that the new United Kingdom Nationality and Borders Bill, which has been denounced by the opposition and agents working with refugees and migrants and concerned with human rights, that this new bill, in addition to the danger it poses for asylum seekers and refugees and asylum children, is actually more likely to make trafficking and sexual abuse of women more likely. It's a really damning report. It says the bill fails to acknowledge the government's obligation to ensure protection of migrants, asylum-seeking children in violation of international law. It says the government's repeated public statements on combating trafficking and modern slavery must be matched by concrete action, and this bill doesn't do that. Now, I think a lot of people are often surprised when they hear that modern slavery is such a big problem. But I think those of us who, I work with refugees and asylum seekers in my day job, and I know that that clearly is a huge problem. But the fact that the United Nations, Jools, have said the British government is at risk of being in breach of international law, does the British government care? Because it's not the first time they've been accused of that.
Well, I think the short answer to that is no, they don't. Otherwise, this wouldn't have come forward. I mean, we've seen around sort of my neck of the woods gangmasters being arrested after major Police Scotland operations. So people being kept in squalid, utterly appalling conditions to work in fields. People who've come from Europe perhaps, or who have learning disabilities, and just utterly shocking. I genuinely think that most of us don't realise how big an issue it actually is, and how problematic this bill is for people who are vulnerable in these situations. So is the opposition to it enough? I don't know. There's not a great track record of the UK government listening on these issues, and look at the mess that everything is in just now. Are enough of us paying attention to that? I hesitate to answer that bit of it, but it hugely concerns me, and I just long for the day when we've got 100% control over our own legislation around these issues, because I know humanity will be at the core of it.
The other problem is that the whole bill has been sold, if you like, by Priti Patel to the party faithful and certain elements of the wider British public on the basis that it's an anti-immigration bill and it's an anti-asylum bill. And for a lot of people, that's all they're looking for because they simply don't understand the issues involved. But I think it goes to something deeper. I don't think generally in the United Kingdom, people really understand human rights. They don't really understand what they're for. They don't really understand that we are all covered by human rights legislation. And there seems to be a kind of feeling in some quarters, the kind of people who vote Conservative often, that human rights are somehow only rights that are given to people who are less deserving than the rest of us. And you hear regularly, the fact that it's all about letting prisoners not have to slop out in the morning, or it's all about giving prisoners the vote, or it's all about giving people who don't have right to enter or remain in the country more rights. And I think that's really, really damaging. I mean, one of the things that I've been saying for a while almost needs to happen, Elena, is a sort of what have human rights ever done for us campaign. But I think people need to understand that in terms of Scotland and the Scottish Parliament and Scottish legislation, that is all fundamentally and legislatively needs to be linked to human rights. So can you give a bit of background to that, and can you just explain really what's been happening in Scotland around human rights, the First Minister's Human Rights Leadership programme, for example?
I mean, I think it's really interesting, Maggie, if we think about the moves that the Scottish Government cross-party made in the last term to legislate for children's human rights, and then to look in this term about legislating for the rights of those with disabilities, and for then that first one about the Convention of Rights of the Child to be swept away by the UK government saying you don't actually have the right to legislate in that way. I think that's really telling. And for me, I think that cross-party, even in the Scottish Parliament, there's a fundamental belief that we are working towards human rights. And I think if we think about this Borders Bill, one of the things that it seeks to do is for them to have the ability to strip people of their citizenship. Now, to me, that creates this kind of two-tier system of you maybe have citizenship now, but maybe in the future you might actually have that removed from you. Now, I'm a dual national. I moved to Canada when I was 6. We were economic migrants, and that's how I will term my family, because we were seeking to move away from Margaret Thatcher's destruction of Scotland. But we were a white family. We're not looked at as economic migrants, but that's what we were. We're kind of called expats, and I hate that term. Because fundamentally we were the same as other people that seek to move around about the world for economic reasons. So I've got massive concerns about this Borders Bill, and I also have concerns about the policing bill that's going alongside of it. If we think about the rights of our gypsy traveller communities, that's going to significantly impact down south in England, whereas up here in Scotland, we have an action plan that's joint between the Scottish Government and the local authorities across Scotland, seeking to fundamentally shift the rights that our gypsy travellers have across Scotland, so that they can enjoy those human rights that they already currently have, but are not being realised by policy and practice across the country. So I think there's a fundamental difference between the way that we operate in Scotland and what we're seeing down south.
I think you're right to raise the policing bill in England, because in a way it's almost as if the two need to go together in some ways, because they need the police kind of on side, although obviously it doesn't, that bill doesn't have any currency in Scotland. And I'm glad you mentioned the issue around citizenship, because that's something else that the UN also raised in their letter, which was that it will increase the possibility of arbitrary deprivation of citizenship. That has a troubled history in Britain. We know when the Windrush scandal is a classic example. And the problem is these arbitrary deprivations of citizenship are always rooted in racism and discrimination. And that is something that is of extreme concern. Jools, do you think I'm right when I say people don't really understand human rights, that they kind of somehow don't think they relate to them, that it's something for other people, and maybe that's part of the problem?
Yeah, and I think, going back to what I said about trafficking, I think most people don't really believe or understand either what trafficking is and how much of it does actually happen in Scotland. So yes, they seem to think that, you know, human rights are something that you apply to someone other than you. And I remember being involved in working with young people in the early 90s around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and trying to raise awareness with children and young people around what their rights are. And if you look, I think, at our fostering and adoption system, and the evolution of the promise in Scotland, for example, I think we're quite a long way away in places from delivering on those rights for children, particularly when they're looked after by local authorities. And that's right on our doorstep. It's children. I mean, as a corporate parent, and Elena will know this as well, these things worry me hugely, and it's a real challenge in the roles that we have um, to support those children and young people around and their rights, and are they being met? But it's something that is front and centre to my mind as we roll out the promise. There's a huge amount of work to do, and I think that links into the debate around the Gender Recognition Act as well, actually.
Mm. Well, of course, all these abuses of potential human rights and the racism and the discrimination and the hated nationality and borders bill and the policing bill in England are all happening, of course, on Boris Johnson's watch. So here's the question: what costume shall Boris wear to tomorrow's parties? The revelations that have been being revealed in the last few days, particularly about the culture of blatant contempt being held for the British public in the party culture that's been going on in Number 10, is pretty shocking. For an old cynic like me, it's even been quite shocking. The pictures of the beer fridge being smuggled in the back door, the suggestion that people were sent to off licence with suitcases to fill them with bottles of wine. It clearly wasn't just a couple of Christmas parties. It's been going on and on and on. And Boris Johnson's ridiculous assertion in Parliament that he didn't know he was going to a party, he thought he was going to a work event, has finally, I think, by large sections of the British public been seen for what it is. But one of the interesting things, as far as I'm concerned, is the issue that seems to have maybe been the straw that's broken that particular camel's back is the discovery that there were parties held on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral, a time that the BBC call a time of national mourning. Well, not all of us necessarily thought it was a time of national mourning. And while it's poignant to see pictures of the Queen sitting on her Tod in a church, we have to remember there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people who had to sit on their own at the funerals of their loved ones. And there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people whose funerals were happening the day after or the day of parties at Number 10 Downing Street. So, Elena, are you surprised in a way that the kind of thing that seems to upset people, particularly in England, is the connection with the royal family?
It doesn't surprise me because I think there's this seemingly love of the pomp and circumstance around about the monarchy, and I think that for some people that was the straw that broke the camel's back. For me, it actually speaks to the fact that, you know, this whole premise that somehow COVID was some type of leveler is just absolutely ridiculous. I think that if you have privilege, and if you do come into that with that attitude of having privilege, then you got away with so many different things. And I think that, you know, just now we're seeing a prime minister who absolutely took the entire of the UK for mugs. And, you know, I tweeted that, you know, Prime Minister, do you think we button up the back that you didn't know that you were actually stumbling into a party in your back garden? And I think that for me, it actually undermines that public health message. And that's one of the, you know, the worst parts of all of this. People are now thinking, why did I sacrifice everything that I sacrificed? And going forward, when we have, you know, perhaps in the future, other public health messaging that's really important, are people going to ignore that because they're going to remember that they weren't with their loved one when they passed away, they couldn't go to one of their friends' funerals, or they missed so many different milestones in their lives, or their children didn't meet their grandparents for over a year after they were born. People are going to think about that and are maybe not going to stick to any public health messaging coming down the line. As for Boris Johnson, he's got to go. There's no question in my mind that, you know, that he's not fit to hold that office. But we knew what he was like when he got the job in the first place.
Yeah, we've all known he's never been fit from day one. And I think back almost to the halcyon days of Dominic Cummings driving to Barnard Castle and us all being terribly outraged and wondering why more wasn't done. But now we see why, because none of this has been seen by Boris Johnson really as being anything to do with him or his cabinet. Jules, I would agree he has to go, but it's not as simple as that. In order for there to be a challenge within the Conservative Party, there has to be 54 Conservative MPs write to the 1922 committee. And at the moment, I think there's maybe 5 or 6 that we know about. I don't think that's going to happen. What are the chances, do you think, of the opposition in Westminster bringing forward a vote of no confidence and winning it, given that the Conservatives have a large majority?
I think there'd be more chance if that came from the Conservatives, and goodness knows it might be very busy on the networks over this weekend. And as you say, I mean, we all knew what he was like. If you didn't know there was a party, it was a party. This kind of suggests to me that this is business as usual, and people are behaving like that when they're trying to run the country, which is really concerning, but not terribly surprising. Um, I guess part of me is deeply cynical, and the other part is hopeful that his own party will do the graft on this, and they would get support. I'm absolutely sure from the opposition in the House. Um, I keep asking myself, where would we be if this was happening in Scotland? And it would have ended a long, long time ago. There are two different sets of standards, and well, to me, he's breached all of them. And if you're asking about what he would wear to the party tomorrow, I think he'd be wearing the Emperor's new clothes.
Probably. Elena, however, there was a poll has come out just recently that said 90% of people in Scotland think that he's just a liar, and 80% think that Boris Johnson should go. I don't know what's happened to that 10% who think he's a liar but think that's okay. So, in some ways, does it not suit Scotland, and does it not suit pro-Indy camp to kind of keep Boris Johnson there and making a mess of things because it makes more of an issue? It kind of shows that clear blue water, if you like, between the two administrations and the obvious leadership of Nicola Sturgeon against the absolutely no leadership of Boris Johnson. Is there any sense that keep it going for a bit longer because, enough rope sort of thing?
I mean, I think a cynical person would agree with that, absolutely. I think that, we can see fundamentally that there's very big differences in leadership styles and just truthfulness in terms of both, Boris Johnson and Nicola Sturgeon. But fundamentally, I have a brother that lives down in Leeds, and I don't want him to be in a situation where he's continued to be governed by this, this bumbling person who feels as if they can get away with doing anything. So I think that, for his own party MSPs up here to be calling for his removal, and for Douglas Ross, to decide that that's the way to go. I think the interesting thing for me is if they can't put clear blue water between themselves and their party down south, they're going to go into the May's council elections really on the back foot and really are going to struggle. And I don't think that they're going to come out with the same results as they had in 2017, because the public in Scotland simply at this point in time don't trust them. So how Douglas Ross is going to play that, I'm not so sure that he thinks he might at this point in time.
Come on to Douglas Ross in a minute, but I don't have any figures for voting intention for the local elections, but there has been a poll of voting intentions if there was a general election. It's got SNP on a massive 53% share of the vote, with Conservatives down to 21, so that's a 32% point lead, which is huge by anyone's standard. That would give the SNP 57 of 59 seats. It's the highest. 56 was the last highest, with one Lib Dem, one Labour, and no Conservative seats in Scotland. So once again, Scotland would be a Tory-free zone in terms of Westminster. And it's suggesting that pro-Indy support has gone up to 56%. But I have to say, and I've said this before, if we're only at 56%, with all of what's happening in Westminster, with all of the absolute contempt that is being shown to the devolved administrations, and we'll come on to Jacob Rees-Moggs's particular brand of contempt in a minute, Is that not a wee bit disappointing, Jules? Should we not be up at 66%, 70%?
I would love to see that, and speaking to people around my ward and my council area, I know they see a big difference between Nicola's leadership and Boris Johnson's leadership, particularly in terms of COVID. And I know voting intention. I'd look forward to see voting intentions as well, but I know people trust Nicola more. They might not have liked her for whatever reason, but they trust what she says, and they completely mistrust what Boris Johnson says. And that has made a massive difference. And that, I think, is what we're seeing on those polls. Um, I'm not sure what we need to do to get that up to that 66%. I wonder if people are just kind of sitting on the fence. And we in Women for Indie got some research around women's voting intentions, and it's really interesting to see that women have gone over the 50% now.
Mm.
I'm not claiming credit for all of that for Women for Indie, but I'm sure it's part of it. But women make their decisions later in the day. They're much more inclined to gather information, to question things, and rather than to be stuck in a particular mindset, they will look at what people are saying. They will ask questions, and based on, I guess, their perception of honesty and integrity, will make their decisions accordingly. So that gives me some hope that there's maybe some way to go yet, actually, and people are maybe waiting to see what the manifesto for change actually is. And I think our citizens' assemblies have maybe been a really helpful model for having some of those debates.
So Eleanor was suggesting that the outcome for the local elections, which I said were next year, but of course they're this year, I'm still on 2021 time, might look very bad for the Scottish Tories. So that might look good for you in Angus, Jules, because you're in opposition to a Conservative
Well,
independent
um,
coalition.
you're right. I think it's going to be interesting. I wouldn't want to prejudge any particular outcome there, but I know there's quite a few of our administration councillors stepping down there, Tories and independents, in an unholy alliance, a coalition of chaos. So it will be interesting to see who stands again, who doesn't stand. The response over the last 4.5 years to some of the decisions that the administration's made has not helped them, I think. And actually, in our administration, they're 100% white men, most of them quite elderly. There's not a single woman in the Angus Council administration. There's 5 of us in the SNP group and 1 independent out with the administration. The demographics are horrific, and I would really love to see that change. I think there's a lot to play for here.
I said we'd come back to Douglas Ross, but obviously he came out quite a while ago, actually. I think over the Dominic Cummings debacle was the first time he came out and made it clear he was not too impressed with Mr. Johnson. He's now claiming that all the MSPs in Holyrood think that Johnson should resign. But I think I'm right in saying, Elena, that he's the only Westminster MP who has come out and said that. Do you know if that's true?
Yeah, I believe that's still true. I think he's still the only one that's nailed his colours to the mast there, and probably has written to the 1922 committee. I think that we're still to see whether any of the other Scottish MPs are going to decide to go that way. And I think that that's actually going to set them apart again from their MSP colleagues. And to me, this speaks of the wider issue that we have of the kind of the way that those in the Westminster elite circles actually view Scotland as a whole, not just their Scottish party colleagues who they're treating abysmally and as a branch office, but actually Scotland. And Rees-Mogg was going on about Alistair Jack was a man of much greater standing. I mean, you couldn't find somebody in Scotland and ask them who Alistair Jack was for love nor money, but many people know who Douglas Ross was, but for him, the Secretary of State of Scotland was more important than the leader of the Scottish Tory party, and that speaks volumes.
Well, it does. It is hurley contempt, and I'm sure you, like lots of us, watched the Kirsty Wark interview, and Kirsty Wark's probably had a few fairly shocking things said to her. But when Jacob Rees-Mogg came out and said basically Douglas Ross is a lightweight, she was really lost for words. Oofed was her famous comment, in which she actually stopped asking the question. She was so shocked. But do you think there's any possibility then? So people are talking about, is this a real civil war? Is there going to be a schism? Are the Conservatives in Scotland going to break free? We forget, of course, that the merger between the Scottish Unionists and the Conservative Party in England and Wales only dates back to the 1960s. The last time that the Conservative Party won an election in Scotland was back in the 1950s. So actually to suggest, or for commentators to suggest that there might be some kind of split isn't something that's not happened before. Jools, do you think there's any possibility that we might see a separation between the Scottish Conservative Party and the rest of the UK?
I think Alistair Jack's got form on this. I mean, I think he has tried to do this in the past, and what they're doing there is really just reaffirming the notion of independence for Scotland. If they can't function within a UK-wide party of their own that is pro-union, they need to break away, thereby giving us evidence for the value of an independent Scotland. People who are based in London, in Westminster, should not be making decisions for what's right for Scotland. Ergo, here we go, independence. And actually, there must be some of them that think, if we were independent and we had our own separate country, we could well do better in elections, because people in a proportional representation system need to see people who represent their views in that legislative forum. They've more chance of doing that in an independent Scotland. But whether that trickles through or not,
it absolutely does. And that's one of the reasons the Labour Party have always said the reason we don't support independence is because it would open the door for the Conservatives to pick up that power base that they had of the 1950s. And my argument to Labour MSPs has been, well, it's your job to stop that happening, surely. So just because it happened before and it might happen again isn't necessarily a reason to not listen to what your own voters are saying. And of course, there is a Conservatives for Yes lobby group and group. I think they have a different agenda. They have different reasons for wanting independence. But I think you're right, Jules. I think it's because they see it as an opportunity. But and that's what democracy is about. It's absolutely right that a parliament represents the views of its people. So if that means there are more Conservative MSPs in a future independent Scotland, so be it. I mean, I think the whole shape of a future parliament in independent Scotland would look very different anyway. But Elena, it's interesting, isn't it, when you think that Douglas Ross and his cohorts, both Westminster and Holyrood, are the people who are being tasked with holding the precious union together. So if Douglas Ross is kind of saying, well, there's this big schism, is that putting that defence of the union at risk? And even more importantly, given that really, in terms of maintaining a position of power in Westminster, Boris Johnson doesn't need the Tory MPs, are we now getting to the point where if it's about saving Boris Johnson and that right-wing agenda, as opposed to saving the union, actually, maybe saving Boris Johnson and that right-wing agenda is more important, and maybe that grip on the union is beginning to weaken? Or am I just being hopeful, Elena?
I think it's a good place to be hopeful about, though, Maggie. I think that if that actually works that way, because the whole thing is really ironic when you start hearing them talk about, Scotland's Tories can't be ruled from Tories 400 miles away. Well, as Jill said, that actually, speaks to our whole argument for independence. I think, Douglas Ross does find himself in a very difficult position because he is trying to maintain this union. And then he's got, Professor Tompkins in the background going on every media that there's possible uncomfortable to talk about absolutely separating, their party up here from the party down south. And I think that you're right, Maggie. They did enjoy better electoral results in Scotland prior to them coming together as a party, but that's going to take a while for the people in Scotland to actually accept that type of move. They're not going to do that between now and May for the council elections. There would be a huge amount of work that would have to be done for them to rebrand themselves, I think. But yeah, if this helps to unravel the union, I say keep going for it, Douglas Ross.
Yeah, but it might happen in time for the next UK general election, I guess. If
Yeah.
anyone really kind of wants to know about the history of that, of the Conservative Party before the merger and just how their fates have changed, can I recommend there's a very good sort of 10-minute read on Ballot Box Scotland's Twitter account that gives all the kind of background to that. Today's had a theme running through it, really, and that theme has been about white male privilege in many ways, starting off with Djokovic right through to the person that probably encapsulates white male privilege more than most, Boris Johnson, by way of members of the royal family. New Year's resolutions are something that I don't know if either of you made any New Year's resolutions this year. I absolutely decided not to. I don't like falling at an early fence, as it were. But if you had a wish for the new year rather than a resolution, both of you, what would it be? And you can't say independence for Scotland because that's not likely to happen this year. It has to be something that you want to see a change happen. I'll start with you, Jools. What would your wish for 2022 be?
To end violence against women and girls.
Okay, Elena?
I think for me, it would be for everybody around the world to recognise their privilege where they have it, and for that not to be just dismissed by those that have the privilege. I think that would actually help to end violence against women and a whole host of other things.
I think it
And
absolutely
be
would.
kind.
Sorry?
Be kind. Be
kind.
kinder.
Yes. Well, thank you both very much for joining me today. That's been a fantastic discussion. It just leaves me to end the programme as I usually do, just to remind you that it takes money to keep this show on the road and all the bits and pieces that Broadcasting Scotland do. And we're always looking for people to become regular subscribers and make regular donations. The website's up on the screen just now, so please, if you've enjoyed the programme today and if you believe in independent broadcasting that has a different message from that you might see from mainstream broadcasting, please click on the link and think about making a regular donation. It just leaves me to thank my guests again. Thank you, Jools. Thank you, Elena. And I'll see you again on Thursday evening for the 7 o'clock show. Thank you and have a lovely Sunday.